So let's get started. Okay, so what do we want to do? These are, I don't know if people can see the videos very clearly. These are three different videos of phenomena associated with people walking, running, moving around. And this is a video of an astronaut skipping on the moon. This is a video of something that happened now 14 years ago. Maybe some of you have seen the video of this. This is called the Millennium Bridge across the Thames River, and when about 200 or a few hundred people got on it, it started shaking sideways, and people walked in synchrony with themselves and with the bridge, scaring a lot of people. So that happened. And this is an amputee walking with a robotic prosthetic device and with its own weird controller dynamical properties. And what we would like to do is come up with a theory or principles that lets us understand why is it that astronauts on the moon prefer to skip more or less most of the time rather than walk or run. Why did this happen? What about human walking dynamics happened to couple them to the bridge in this way that the bridge swayed in this crazy manner? So we would like to understand that, and we would like to understand maybe how people interact with other devices that input power to them, like a prosthetic device in this case, but it could be many other things. The bridge, for instance, is also some other device that adds energy to the person. Right? So we would like principles that give us some handle on sort of these kinds of questions. Okay, so this talk has two parts conceptually. The first part is energy optimality. The second part is stability and control, both related to human locomotion. And if you've seen me give a talk, you might have seen this video. Human legs, that's the musculature of a human leg, has about 50 muscles in each leg, maybe more than 50 muscles. And healthy human legs are capable of incredible behavioral complexity. You can walk, run, skip, walk backward, forward, sideways, hop, skip, jump. Some people can play soccer, break dance, whatever. So you can do all this stuff. And why don't we do this when we want to go from A to B? So that's a principal scientific question, in our opinion. So why don't we walk like this? Why don't we walk the way we actually do? Right? So one reasonable answer is that it looks silly. Right? So if you want to go from A to B and if you walk like that person did, it would look silly. I think that's a reasonable answer because human behavior is in fact dictated by what other people think of us, partly. So it's a reasonable scientific hypothesis. But that hypothesis, I think, comes about. The fact that it looks silly is only because no one does it. If everyone was doing it, it wouldn't look silly. And no one does it because there is another reason for no one doing it, which is that we think it's too energy inefficient. Right? We waste a lot of energy if we walk in a manner that looks silly to us. And this idea is not new. You could come up with it like 2 seconds after I asked that question, perhaps. This idea is actually maybe 500 years old, maybe more, depending on who you read. And experimentally, people have found evidence for this hypothesis that people move in a manner that does not waste a lot of energy. So these are sort of energy per unit distance, typically, or unit time on the y-axis, and some variable of interest on the x-axis. The units are too small, but the units don't matter. This energy per unit distance on the y-axis, speed on the x-axis. So this is actually energy measurements of people walking on a treadmill. You put a person on a treadmill, and you measure the energy cost. And the way you measure energy cost for a person, as a person is walking or running or doing whatever, is by measuring the oxygen consumption. Right? You have a device which has a mask, which takes sample out of the air you breathe in and out, and this sample gets analyzed for the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide content. And from which you get the oxygen carbon dioxide flux going in and out through the nose and the mouth, and from which you can approximate the energy cost that the whole body is expending. The reason why oxygen and carbon dioxide is important is because your muscles use energy. Eventually, oxygen is involved in some manner after you make some assumptions. Okay, so here energy is measured this way, and energy is plotted on the y-axis here, and speed on the x-axis. So this is walking too slowly. Energy per unit distance is very high. Walking too fast, energy per unit distance is again very high. There's an optimal speed, which is about 1.3 meters per second, and that person is probably walking at about 1.3 meters per second, is my guess. Maybe a little bit slower. But if you watch people in a big bus station or on a street milling around or walking with some goal in mind, and you draw a distribution of the speeds at which people walk, you find that the peak is approximately pretty close to, the peak is pretty close to this, the minimum of this cost. People have done lots of different variants of this experiment over the last 50 years. This is the same plot, but except while the y-axis is still energy, the x-axis is now stride length. So you make people walk with really long steps, right? Hopefully I don't lose my mic. Or really short steps, right? So like that. But with the speed fixed, and then you draw this plot of energy as a function of stride length, and you find that there is a natural stride length, which people naturally prefer, which also has the lowest energy cost, right? So this is not at all necessary, but it happens to be the case, and it's good that it happens to be the case. Similarly, people have done experiments with step width. More remarkably, people have done experiments with subjects that are wearing prosthesis or walking on crutches and so on. So these experiments were done with healthy adults with no disabilities, if you will. And this experiment was done with the person walking with a prosthesis and amputation. And you find that when you do these experiments with different subject populations, you find similar results. Right? A person walking with crutches walks slower, you might say, because maybe there is pain, maybe they can't walk faster, but what seems to be consistent with data is that they can walk faster, but it's not energetically good to walk faster. Okay? So actually that kind of data, which is already 50 years old, gives promise that energy optimality as a theory could be predictive of not just normal human behavior, but human behavior in various abnormal situations with various muscular deficits or whatever, and gives us hope that it could be a theory that lets us get a handle on locomotor diseases and so on. Okay, so that's classic data. This was a little undergraduate project. We decided to test, just for fun, what would happen if we subjected this hypothesis to a silly test. Like, are people good at doing very unusual things close to optimally in terms of energy? So we had 10 people, and we asked them to walk sideways like this. So I like to say these were not habitual sideways walkers. They're not walking around sideways all the time. And we asked them to walk naturally at their natural speed and measure their speed about 0.6 meters per second, half as fast as a normal person walking forward, right? So that's their natural speed, whatever that meant, right? So people pick that speed immediately without any practice. And then we measure the energy cost with the same technology that I just described, measuring the oxygen consumption, putting the person on a treadmill and making them walk sideways. And we measure the cost as a function of speed. And that red curve is actually the cost as a function of speed. And there is a minimum. It's a shallow minimum, but there's a minimum. And if you take the average preferred walking speed and compare it with the average optimal walking speed, they differ by 2 decimal places. They differ at the second decimal place, which is incredibly close. Of course, each individual is slightly different from every other individual. So there's individual variability, but on average, it seems remarkably close for something that we don't do at all and something that we did not give the subjects any practice for. So it looks like, at least on average, this theory is good, and this theory is good for even unusual tasks. Okay. So we also discovered by doing this little weird sideways walking experiment that sideways walking costs you a lot of energy. Turns out for the same speed, walking sideways costs you about 3 or 4 times as much energy as walking forward for a given distance. Now, that could be the reason why. You might say, if I want to go from here to here, the right thing to do, you would think, or the thing that most people would do, if you want to go just a little bit to the side, you would probably just step sideways. But if you want to go a long distance, what you would do is turn and then walk forward and then turn back, right? So people do this thing where, or if you're doing a more complicated thing, you would do something, so I sort of call this behaviorally non-holonomic. I don't know how many people in the audience know what non-holonomic means, but what in this case I mean is people can go sideways, but they don't want to, right? Just like cars, more or less. Cars, if you want them to go sideways, what you usually use is parallel parking, right? So you don't actually make a car go sideways, you do something complicated to go sideways, which we call parallel parking. And people, even though they can go sideways, typically do something more complicated where they turn and walk facing forward. Okay. Please feel free to stop me if you have any general questions. Okay, so that's a little study about sideways walking, which is just an example of something people seem to be weirdly good at.
The energy was measured again by measuring the oxygen. So the optimality is an average, not an individual optimal.
By individual, you mean comparing an individual's optimal speed with his or her individual preferred speed. So we did all kinds of comparisons. And what you can show, well, if you compare the individual optimal speed and the individual preferred speed, they differ in the first decimal place, like 0.5 to 0.6 and things like that. So the optimal speed might be 0.6, the person might prefer 0.5 or 0.7 or 0.55 or 0.65 and so on. But on average, it's much, much closer, which perhaps is understandable. But I think the individual optimal speed or even the average optimal speed is not that incredibly precise anyway, because if you notice, this curve is incredibly flat, right? So the curvature is very small here, which means that for a very large change in speed, there is a very small cost penalty. So even though individuals had considerable behavioral variability, say between 0.5 and 0.7 meters per second, the energy penalty that they paid is within 1%, it turned out, of their optimal energy cost. So even though in terms of behavioral, the actual velocity, they differed from what we call the optimal velocity. Maybe we cannot call it optimal because there is all kinds of errors in these measurements. So we cannot be so precise about this concept of individual optimal speed anyway. But if you want to call it that, I think maybe the more reasonable thing to say is that individuals were within 1% of their optimal energy cost as measured by this device. Yes?
That walking sideways is about 3 to 4 times more expensive than walking forward.
Yeah.
How much of that 3 to 4 times comes from the fact that the muscles are attached at certain locations? From kinematics, presumably you can come up with an estimate of how much more energy it will cost in a cycle.
Right.
Just from kinematics, because the muscles are attached at a certain point away from the ends of your bone, and using that we may be able to get an estimate.
Absolutely. So I didn't tell you the whole story of this little study. I have a little video here, which is not that great. But what's happening here is it's an animation of sideways walking motion. But what you can see already, both in that video and me doing sideways walking, is that I stop every step. My center of mass comes to almost complete rest, when both feet are together. It's not still going this way. Which is throwing away kinetic energy and then putting it back in, throwing it away, putting it back in, throwing it away. Right, that contributes almost everything. Yeah. So in normal human walking, there is velocity fluctuation of the center of mass, fore-aft velocity fluctuation, but it's not nearly as high as completely stopping. It's maybe 5% instead of 100%. So we have a little model with analytical results that explains the three-time multiple. Okay, so let me tell you about another little study. Let's first perhaps watch the video. If people can see the video, that's a horse on a big horse treadmill. And they're slowly increasing the speed of the treadmill. And let me rewind the video a little bit. So initially the treadmill is slow, the horse is walking. And now the treadmill is a little bit faster. The horse is doing what's called trotting, which is a running leg gait for a horse, where diagonally opposite legs hit the ground simultaneously. So these two legs hit the ground, then these two legs, and so on. So that's a running leg gait for a horse, and then the treadmill speed is increased even more, and then it goes into galloping. It does this. People can hear me. So the legs hit the treadmill in sequence, as opposed to diagonally opposite pairs hitting it simultaneously. So horses have these three, and some horses have many more stereotypically different ways of moving for different speeds. People in this field call them gaits. So for humans, you would call walking and running as a gait. For horses, you would call walking, trotting, and galloping as a gait. And the transition from one gait to another is called a gait transition. And the classic experiments, either in horses or in humans, were done on treadmills, because there it's most convenient to control the speed, right? So this experiment was, of course, done first on a person rather than a horse, where you put a person on a treadmill. The treadmill is going slowly. You slowly increase the speed of the treadmill, and at a particular speed, roughly around 2 meters per second, you switch gaits from walking to running, and then you run for whatever higher speed. And then if you slowly decrease the speed, you switch gaits again from running to walking around 2 meters per second, but not exactly the same as the walk to run transition, it turns out. And can we explain that gait transition, which is sort of a phase transition between two kinds of solutions, using energy optimality? And turns out we can approximately. And this figure is all that you need. So this blue curve is energy per unit time for walking as a function of speed. And this red curve is energy per unit time for running as a function of speed. And these two curves cross around here, which means that beyond this speed, walking is more expensive than running, and below this speed, running is more expensive than walking. Right? So around the speed, if you're increasing speed, you should switch from walking to running and running to walking, if your speed is constrained and if you want to save energy. Right? You can walk much faster, but you prefer not to because you're wasting energy. Similarly, you can run very slowly, but you prefer not to because you're wasting energy. Okay? There is small differences between the actual transition speeds and what energy optimality exactly predicts based on this measurement. But in my opinion, there are just so many uncertainties and unknowns and errors in all these measurements that these small differences, even though statistically significant, apparently, I don't know if we should take them very seriously right now. Maybe 10 years from now we should. Okay, so that's the classic experiment that lots of other people have done. Maybe there are about 15 papers doing variants of what I just described. Change the speed of the treadmill continuously but slowly, or continuously and fast, or in a series of steps. A million different permutations and combinations have been done. We decided to take the experiment on the road, so to speak, and decided to essentially make something slightly more realistic. People, when they behave in normal life, are not stuck on treadmills. So we decided to do the gait transition experiment, but in a slightly more naturalistic task. And the task is the following. You want to go from A to B, not on a treadmill, but over ground. And so the total distance is specified. Let's say it's a straight line. And what we specify is the total time as well, right? So treadmill specifies the speed, especially a short treadmill, specify the speed instantaneously. You don't have much room for changing your forward speed relative to the belt. But here, what we have constrained is the total distance and the total time. So your average speed is specified, but not the instantaneous speed. So you could, in principle, run incredibly fast and then slow down and crawl or something like that. So only the average is specified, not the instantaneous. So this experiment constrains the task very differently from a treadmill task. Okay? So what do people do? This is what people do. This is the prescribed average speed on the x-axis, right? So low speeds, this is 1 meter per second, means that for a given distance, you give them a lot of time. And high speeds means for a given distance, you give them very little time, so they have to go fast. And on the y-axis is the time fraction of running, right? So in each of these, by the way, I forgot to mention how we enforce the time. The subjects are given a stopwatch, which is counting down time, and they have to reach the destination exactly when the stopwatch runs out. And it's remarkable how good people are at hitting the target within a second of the stopwatch running out. Yeah. No practice. Again, no practice. It's just amazing. No practice, people hit the mark within a second. Occasionally, they go 2 seconds over or something like that. Yeah, so that's what we did. So this is the time fraction of running. So, and mostly this curve is what you would expect. So if you ask them to go at a very low average speed, which means you give them a lot of time, they just walk to the destination, which is good. And if you, in other words, the time fraction of running is close to 0. If you give them very little time, the time fraction of running is close to 1. They just run all the way, which makes sense. But for this intermediate range of average speeds, in other words, the time is neither too low or too high, they use a mixture of walking and running, which starts from essentially 0 for low prescribed average speeds and goes to close to 1 for high prescribed average speeds. And you can see that, of course, there's a lot of, these dots are individual subjects and individual trials, a lot of variability, but there's a general trend. And this is actually 5 different subjects somewhere in this regime doing a mixture of walking and running. So these curves have little time on the x-axis and speed on the y-axis measured using GPS. And this person is walking for a while, low speed, and then running for a while, walking for a while, running for a while, running for a while, walking for a while. This person does something complicated. This person looks like this person just jogged all the way, okay? So people do have slightly different behaviors, but on average, and for most people, seem to use a mixture of walking and running. Can we explain this with energy optimality? And it turns out we can, surprisingly. And the mathematical argument goes like this. So the blue curve is still the walking cost at various speeds. The red curve is the running cost at various speeds. If your speed is fixed and if you're allowed to choose only walking or only running, you will track either the blue curve if you choose walking or the red curve if you choose running. But if you're allowed to do an average of walking and running, in other words, do walking at one speed and running at another speed, what you can do is in this regime where I've shaded yellow, which is defined by drawing the common tangent between these two curves, you can do better than just walking or just running. This is actually a classic thing that appears all over the place. People doing phase transitions know all about this. And has to do with the non-convexity of the lower envelope of these two curves, which allows you to draw this common tangent. And what you can do is do better than the lower envelope and go all the way up to the common tangent if you do a mixture of walking and running. So it can do a little pencil and paper calculation to find the various points and so on. This pink curve is what is predicted by doing this little analysis, and this is the experiment. It's not too bad. It looks approximately okay. This little calculation assumes that there is no cost for changing gaits or changing speeds. If you include a cost for changing gaits or changing speeds, you get a slightly different pink curve, which maybe is even better. But we don't know the exact values of the various constant that we must use. So there is a little flexibility in how good these matches look like. Okay. So there are a few implications of what I just said. We think, at least, these are speculations, predictions. It turns out that a child walking next to a parent and the parent walking at their natural average preferred speed, 1.3, 1.4 meters per second, the child is put at this uncomfortable gate transition speed. So the optimal thing for a child to do, if it's walking next to a parent, keeping pace roughly, is to use a mixture of walking and running, so which might get reflected as the child running forward, lagging behind, running forward, lagging behind, and so on. So that would be the predicted behavior. It turns out the dogs, if they're forced to walk next to a person on a long leash, again, you have this non-convexity, which predicts a mixture of walking and trotting. We haven't done careful experiments, so these remain speculations, I guess, or predictions, but we can do them at some point. If you put animals or humans on a long treadmill as opposed to a short treadmill, which is what are in most gyms, at some ranges of speeds, the optimal thing to do is to run forward and then slowly coast backward, walking slower than the treadmill belt and so on. You can show that if you look at average marathon times or sort of average running times, the optimal thing to do for those 10-minute milers is to use about 80% walking and 20% running or so. So lots of different applications, if you will. Okay. And we get some other strange predictions, which maybe I won't go into. Okay, so those are a couple of little studies which demonstrated choices that people make during locomotion, which seems to at least approximately be consistent with energy optimality. You can make a strong, so those were discrete choices, either between walking and running, or sort of univariate choices, the speed at which people walk or people run, or the stride length, and so on. But you can make a much stronger hypothesis of optimality, which is that absolutely everything that we do is optimal. Almost surely this is a false hypothesis, but we would like to see how far we can take this hypothesis and how far it agrees with reality. In other words, yeah, so I guess that's that. So how do we test that hypothesis? We can't really make people do all possible things because it's a big space of possibilities. So what we do is use simple models or more complex models. This is a particularly simple model of a person with a point mass upper body and massless legs. All they can do, the legs can do, is push on the upper body, apply force on the upper body, and lengthen or contract the leg length. And the swing leg can do whatever it wants. So you can make this model track a huge class of sort of forward-going, complicated-looking trajectories. By appropriately changing the leg force or the leg length as a function of time, you can make it do not quite whatever you want, but almost whatever you want. And these are just things that we used a random number generator to create some weird-looking motions. Okay. And then what do we want to do? We would like to translate a particular motion, a particular force as a function of time to an energy cost. And what is energy cost reasonably modeled by? There are various models, and there is some controversy in the field about what a good model is. But a simple model is the fact that when you do positive work on the world, you consume positive energy, you consume energy. In other words, if you raise an object, you need energy for it. If you lower an object by the same amount, in other words, you do negative work, but by the same amount, you do positive energy too. You still need positive energy, but by a smaller amount. So there's these pre-multipliers, B1 and B2, multiplying positive mechanical power, negative mechanical power. B1 is about 4 times B2. And the cost would be the integral of some linear combination of positive and negative mechanical power. That's the simplest model, which has some reasonable biological basis in that you can do experiments where the energy cost is reasonably well correlated with work, positive work and negative work. You can generalize this by bringing the F out and making these functions of velocity. By the way, this is F times V. where F is, say, muscle velocity or the leg force, and V is F is the muscle force or the leg force. V is the muscle length rate or the leg length rate, so that F times V is power. You can generalize that cost, which turns out fits the experimental data on metabolic costs much better using some function there. What does it mean? Negative mechanical power just means this, right? So right now, I'm not carrying a particularly heavy object, but imagine there is a muscle here. Right now, this muscle is producing a force that's balancing the weight of this object and the weight of my hand and so on. And as I lower this object, this muscle lengthens as it's put in the direction of the force, and the length rate is different. So it's doing negative work. It's lowering its potential energy, right? In other words, work gets done on the muscle as opposed to the muscle doing work. But nevertheless, so you might imagine that if work gets done on an actuator, like for instance a motor, you can get energy back, right? So there's something called regenerative braking, which some cars use, some hybrid cars use to get energy from braking. But muscles seem to not have that property. In other words, doing work on the muscle cannot drive biochemical reactions back to store energy. You can't use muscle as a battery, it seems. Most evidence suggests. Maybe there's a little bit there, but not too much. So that's the cost. That's the thing that you want to minimize, and this is an optimization problem where the unknowns are various things. Leg forces is a function of time, initial conditions, and when each leg touches the ground. What I call the structure of the gait. In other words, does it look like walking, where one leg touches the ground, the next leg touches the ground, this leg lifts off? So that's what I mean by structure, which is how many feet are touching the ground at any point in time, that sequence of states. Running would be one leg, 0 legs, 1 leg, 0 legs. Walking would be 1 leg, 2 leg, 1 leg, 2 leg. Skipping would be flying through the air, 1 leg, 2 legs, 1 leg, flying through the air again, so on. So you can do these optimization calculations, which maybe I'll talk about on a couple of days from now, how you do these calculations in MATLAB or other computer software. But once you solve the optimization calculations, what you get are these motions that people had described 100 years ago as simple descriptors of walking and running. So at slow speeds, this optimization problem naturally discovers something that looks like walking. In other words, one leg is on the ground and almost both legs are on the ground, one leg is on the ground, and so on. But the leg is relatively straight. It's called inverted pendulum walking, where one leg is on the ground and you vault over on a relatively straight leg. The next leg hits, you push off, and then that happens over and over again. At higher speeds, you get a motion, an optimal motion that looks like fly through the air, bounce, fly through the air, bounce, fly through the air, bounce. Now these motions, this motion does not look all that much like running, but only because this model was chosen to have 0 parameters. So the things that we could have added to the model, like the maximum leg force that it could produce, but we said it could produce infinity if it wanted to, just because infinity is not a parameter, but Fmax is a parameter. So this model turns out has 0 parameters, and you can't really do anything to cheat to fit to data and so on. And this is what the optimal gaits are. And this is what you get. You get these unrealistic perhaps, but nevertheless walking and running like gaits. And you can make them more realistic, as I will point out in a minute. So you can make them more realistic. You can add muscle-like properties, add springs in series with the muscles, have a kinematic singularity or not. So you can make minor modifications to the leg morphology, and then add in some properties for the muscle. The spring in series with the muscle is basically a tendon, right? Tendon, people have tendons. Some muscles have big tendons, some muscles have small tendons. But tendons are essentially springs which can store energy when work is done on it. You pull it, energy gets stored, and then it can give it back to you after a while. It gives you almost 95% of what you put into it, many tendons. So that does affect the energetics. So yeah. But the upshot of this slide is that when you use this zoo of models with a spring in series, with some muscle properties, with some more complicated leg morphology or something like that, what you can do is predict or explain a whole bunch of qualitative features that people had observed over the last 100 years about walking and running. So for instance, like almost all these models have a walk to run transition. So you set up the model, do an energy optimization calculation, and you ask for a slow speed, you get a walking like motion. In other words, you never fly. That's what we mean by walking. And then for higher speeds, you get running, right? So all the models give that answer. And almost all the models and all the model permutations, combinations, muscle costs, and so on give various symmetry properties. In other words, the left leg does the same thing as the right leg does, except one step apart. Now that, you might say, okay, that makes sense. That's what people approximately do. But that's not a necessity for the optimal solution, right? The model is perfectly capable of asymmetric gaits. It just happens to not be optimal. Human motions are approximately time reversal symmetric, which means that if you run something forward, it doesn't exact. I mean, of course, you can tell whether a person is walking forward or backward. But if you look at the forces that you exert on the ground and things like that, they have a time reversal symmetry, and all these models have that. There are all kinds of different little features of when the muscles go on and off that these models predict or explain. So which is kind of cool that relatively simple models which know nothing about how people walk or run can discover these properties that people have observed over the last 100 years. But the problem, okay, this is an example of a slightly more compliant looking gait which arises from a more compliant looking model because it has a spring in series. So it's a person flying through the air, and then there's a compliant run. This is running. I'm showing only when the leg is touching the ground, which is maybe not so bad, not so good. But this turns out this model almost completely tracks the center of mass motion of the person experimental data. Let me actually make a comment here. So maybe I made it sound too good right here. Not all models give you all these properties, and some models give you nonsense if you ask certain questions of it, right? So the simple models are great at explaining a bunch of models with sort of great parsimony, but they are really bad at answering certain questions. In other words, they're not so robust. Like some questions or some kinds of features appear naturally, but other features do not. And like I said, different models have slightly different features and answers. So, but we would like to know what's the minimal model that can predict everything or as much as possible without our having to tweak things or make ad hoc fixes and so on. How am I doing on time? Okay. So let me give you another example. So we'll come back to this concept or idea of model complexity and how well we can do with simple versus complex models. The next little study I'm going to talk about is people walking not in a straight line. So I call that nonlinear locomotion. And what we did, just like sort of in the sideways walking study, is made people walk in circles for 2 hours and measured the energy cost of people walking in circles of different radii and different speeds. And this is the curve that we get. This is radius, this is tangential speed, this is the energy cost per unit time. And perhaps not surprisingly, for a given tangential speed, as you decrease the radius, the cost increases. Right? If you're going in a straight line, your cost is low. If you're going in a circle at the same tangential speed, your cost is high. Now, can we explain that? Again, we took a relatively simple model, point mass body, massless legs, and with ability to extend and contract arbitrarily. You can make the model by appropriately placing the foot, do complicated trajectories in 3 dimensions. So the blue line, the red line is the trajectory. So you're sort of seeing a 3D view, and it's taking a turn. This is a top view, taking a turn, and these are leg, foot positions and leg directions, if you will. So you can make the model do complicated turns and so on. And again, you can solve this optimization problem, which is what does the model have to do to go in a circle, minimizing this energy cost, periodicity constraints, and so on. Remarkably, you get something similar to what we found before, which is inverted pendulum walking. But now it's not a planar inverted pendulum walking, but a spherical inverted pendulum walking. In other words, the body motion is in 3 dimensions, but the leg length does remain a constant. And then at the end, there is a little push off and then a little heel strike, which are these impulses. Impulses mean infinite forces. You notice that the trajectory is kinky, has little kinks. Kinks mean changes in velocity in infinitesimal amount of time, infinite accelerations which require infinite forces. So these are push-off and heel strike impulses which affect the transition from one inverted pendulum to the next. This is not a smooth transition, it's a non-smooth transition. And all the work, all the energy cost gets done there, and turns out the best thing to do is to do all the work in that transition. Okay, so that's the optimal motion that we got, but does it actually explain the energy cost trends that we saw in the experiment? Turns out it doesn't. And I sort of sat on the data for 6 months trying to figure out a way to explain it. And then after 6 months, I realized people are not point masses. And we do have a moment of inertia, especially when you're turning. It turns out you have to turn your body as well as change the velocity direction of the center of mass. And people happen to turn their body, and the fact that you have this non-zero moment of inertia does play a role. And turns out when you turn, let's say you're going in a circle at a particular speed specifies the average angular speed, but the actual time-dependent angular speed fluctuates wildly, it turns out, of the upper body. When only one foot is on the ground, the upper body turns a lot. When both feet are on the ground, the upper body turns almost not at all. And then it turns a lot, not at all. In other words, speed goes down. So there's huge rotational kinetic energy fluctuations, which seems to require, we think, work done by the legs. And it turns out you can do a little back of the envelope calculation. And you can essentially almost exactly explain the experimental dependence on the radius. This data and the related theory you can use to predict other features of walking, but not in a straight line now. People have done experiments. It's nice that people have done all kinds of weird experiments. People have done experiments measuring the preferred speed of walking of people walking in circles. Turns out people walk a little bit slower in circles. And again, you can, now that we have the cost surface that has a dependence on both velocity and radius, you can find the optimal speed as a function of radius, and it turns out that the optimal speed decreases with radius, which is what people saw in experiment. You can make people walk in complicated curves like cloverleaf, limacon, or whatever, and ellipses of various eccentricities. And people have measured the speeds people naturally choose when asked to walk in these complicated curves. And people walk faster on the straighter parts and slow down on the more curved parts, and which is what a little model predicts as well. So the blue thing is model, the yellow things are experiment. It's not a perfect match, but I would say it's as good as we can get. If you have like a few more subjects, there's going to be a big band of data there. People have a lot of variability. Other people did experiments where you're asked to quote unquote path plan, which means that you're asked to go from this point to this point, and these around this point is a door, around this point is a door, and you're asked to walk this way, end up at this point going in this direction. In other words, the doors prescribe both position boundary conditions as well as sort of tangent boundary conditions. So the direction is fixed, direction is fixed. So people walk this way, and then, so these are actually paths that people chose naturally. Something that you will notice about these paths and the paths that people are using as you're navigating these corridors is that you never take sharp turns, right? So if I want to go there, I don't do this, stop, turn. You don't do that. And it turns out that's not optimal. What you better do is do shallow turns as opposed to sharp turns. Sharp turns waste too much energy, it looks like. Okay, so that was a little study which was meant as an extension of this notion of energy optimality to people not walking in a straight line. Surprisingly, there had not been any experiments or theory even of energetics and energy optimality for people not walking in a straight line before this little study. What we would really like to do, so these are little example studies of little well circumscribed problems. What we would really like to do is predict everything about human walking, which maybe is too grand a goal. So you can put people on level ground, uphill, downhill, altered gravity, uneven terrain, weights on various parts of the body, weird backpacks with weird attachments, with weird elastic properties, weird shoes with various weights. So you can do a million different experiments which have an effect on how people walk and run. People change immediately to the situation you subject them to. And these are just sort of passive examples. You can imagine active examples where you put an exoskeleton and man suit in parallel to a person, or if a person is missing a limb, you have a prosthetic device in series with the limb, and you would like to be able to predict how a person will behave in all those circumstances. Can energy optimality do that? Well, we saw that simple models could predict a whole bunch of things, but they could predict only qualitative things, and I noted that they're not so robust. So perhaps, unfortunately, we might have to do more complex models. So this is a little model, way simpler than a human, but way more complex than the point mass model. It has, these arms are not really there. Single upper body, rigid body is planar, 16 muscles which are sort of line elements which apply moments at various joints, 7 rigid body segments, and so on. And again, by appropriately actuating these muscles in a sufficiently complicated manner, you can make the model dance, for instance, or walk up a slope, or do whatever you want, right? Do you see the crazy dance? Okay, so you can make them do that. And then again, we would like to solve a trajectory optimization problem where we would like the muscle forces as functions of time that produces a motion that minimizes energy consumption while satisfying all the constraints of the problem. Now this is going to be a much, much bigger problem. So what does it mean to set up this problem? Let's count the number of variables. There are 16 muscles, and maybe one period of this motion is a couple of seconds, let's say. And you would like to describe the force as a function of time. And you can describe it maybe as a piecewise linear function of time, maybe with 20 pieces. 20 pieces per muscle, 16 muscles, that's 400 variables. So we're trying to solve for 400 variables or 800 variables. And then the way we set up the problem is similar to a method that's very common in boundary value problems. It's called multiple shooting, where we don't just specify the initial condition, all the muscle forces, simulate it, evaluate the objective function, and then try to find the optimum. Rather, we break the whole motion into lots of little pieces. Each piece has its own unknown initial condition, and each piece has its own unknown force as a function of time. So you not only have about 400 force variables, you'll have about 400 state variables. And then you have lots of constraints that all these little pieces needs to patch up together smoothly and differentiably and so on. And then there are constraints, the fact that you can't exceed what the muscles can produce in terms of force. Your limbs cannot hyperextend, so all kinds of constraints. So it's a huge problem with maybe 1,000 unknowns or a couple of thousand unknowns, depending on how fine you discretize. But turns out it's what's called a sparse problem, which means that if you take the function and try to differentiate it with respect to all the unknowns, the Jacobian or the Hessian is sparse. In other words, only a few are non-zero, most are zero matrix, and the Jacobian of all the constraints, of which there are about 1,000, is also sparse. This is the sparsity pattern. So imagine this is a matrix, and the blue things are the non-zero elements. So we can solve these problems now on a little laptop. Maybe depending on how lucky we are, how good an initial seed that we give, the optimization calculation can take 5 minutes or 1 hour or 2 hours, but never takes a day. But it's a reasonable amount of time. We would like it to be a minute, but so that we can do lots of such calculations. But maybe we are okay with 20 minutes. But what the model again predicts is that slow speeds walking is good, fast speeds running is good. But now walking looks a little bit more realistic. This is actually minimizing a slightly different cost from what I would like to minimize. It's not quite the best model of energy cost that we think there is. In any case, this is actually a person walking at a slow speed. This is a person walking at a fast speed. In other words, our prediction for it. And you notice that this person, this model, is walking with shorter step lengths, and this person is walking with longer step lengths, which comes naturally from the model from energy minimization. For to go slow, you want to use shorter step lengths. So we don't put those things into the model. If you do detailed comparisons of the motion or the forces, there are differences, and we are trying to figure out what the causes of those differences are and what functions that we have to minimize to actually exactly predict human locomotion. So we have a little framework now with which we can do lots of different optimization calculations. We can, so this is, I don't know if these animations are particularly clear in the back row, but this person, even though it looks like running, is actually forced to walk, which means that heel is striking the ground, then toe, the next heel, the next toe, and so on. So that sequence of contact points is fixed, and this is the normal ground reaction force. When the heel strikes the ground, there is a big blip, and then there's relatively flat, and then when you push off, there is a big blip again. And I don't have on this slide human data, but human data looks qualitatively like that. It's not so sharp, it's a little bit smoother, but it's reasonably predictive. You can make people run on toes or heel and toe. You can play with all kinds of combinations. You can make the model walk on toes, and then maybe do experiments of people walking on toes, just to see if the model predicts what people actually do. So we have a framework. We are still exploring its capabilities. 5 minutes? Okay. That's good. So what we would like to do overall in the grand scheme of things is be able to predict a relatively large corpus of human data. And one approach to that is, of course, try different functions to see if optimality of something is predictive of human movement. Maybe it does not. Maybe we are doomed to fail. That's a possibility. But it seems like a promising hypothesis. So we might as well give it our best shot. So one way to give it our best shot is to do what's called inverse optimization, which is like cheating, which is you collect a lot of data and then try to figure out what it is that you have to minimize so that this relatively large corpus of data is quote unquote predicted by this optimization calculation. In other words, now you're not predicting the motion, so rather than predicting or inferring the objective function that is consistent with human movement, observed human movement and energy optimality. So we call this inverse optimization, which is massively more computationally expensive than forward optimization. So we're still working on it. Let me just run through these slides quickly. This is a collaboration with someone. I showed this video earlier on, and this is an attempt to model the person walking with a prosthetic device, and I guess let me just say we are still working on it. And the goal would be to see if we can predict, if we input the properties of this device in this little simulation, then try to find the optimal human movement for those device properties. How well does that agree with data? So far it does not actually, but maybe we're still, let's say, working on it. I showed the shaky bridge at some point in the talk, maybe on the first slide, and we can show that if you have a bridge that shakes and people that are arbitrarily smart with their muscles, which people are not perhaps, but it turns out, strangely enough, counterintuitively enough, that if you have a shaky bridge in which you have a choice between walking with shaking it and walking with not shaking it, there are parameter regimes in which walking with shaking it is actually energy saving. But only if the bridge does not have too much damping and so on, then you're just fighting damping. But if the bridge has low damping, which this bridge did initially, you can actually let the bridge do the work. The bridge is oscillating with very little loss of energy. You essentially let it push your upper body around, keeping the leg relatively constant length. So instead of you doing push-off and heel strike, you let the bridge do a more continuous version of doing push-off and heel strike. So that's the end of part one. So anyway, so the end of part one is essentially, let me summarize part one. You're just touting energy optimality as a universal, if somewhat approximate, theory of human locomotion. We'll see how accurate it can be, I guess, in the long term, and what its limitations are. So I would like to say very, very broadly, there are two big problems in locomotion research. One is to understand the nominal motion, right? So what you actually see people do, the average motion, if you will, like why people walk a certain way. That's one part, and that part seems to be reasonably well described by energy optimality. The other part is what you actually don't see when you actually see people walk, is understand how people walk at all in a manner that they don't fall down in the presence of all kinds of disturbances. This floor is not flat. My muscles are incredibly noisy. If I ask a muscle to produce a particular force, it produces that force plus or minus 10%, which is horrible as an actuator. So there's all kinds of weird things that make our movements noisy and variable and so on. So how are people stable? How are people able to stabilize this top-heavy body? Then there is lots and lots of work. Hundreds of people have written papers doing simulations, building robots, doing fancier simulations of people, or computer simulations or a robot walking stably. In other words, people have device controllers that can make two legs walk stably, either in 2D or 3D. So it doesn't seem all that hard. There are lots and lots of ways to walk stably. This is just like a soup of words that people use, and you don't have to pay attention to what they are. But there just seems like lots of ways to stabilize walking in 2D, 3D for models of different complexity. But we have no idea, it's fair to say, which of these, or if any of these, are used by humans. So we have no sense for, okay, there are lots of ways to stabilize walking, but we don't know how people actually stabilize walking. How would you go about determining how people actually stabilize walking is to essentially probe the dynamical system, and the way you probe the dynamical system is to do perturbation experiments. This is a very famous perturbation experiment. I don't know if people can see it. Someone kicking a big robot. That's a robot, not a horse. It's robot abuse, not horse abuse. And this is a much tinier perturbation of a person. You can barely see the perturbation. But you can see that the person takes appropriate measures, as does the robot. When the person was pushed sideways, the person took a step this way and sort of recovered and so on. So that's what happened. So you can do perturbation experiments, which we're hoping we're getting up to do, but can we understand human stability and control without doing these perturbation experiments? Turns out we might be able to. Let me just give you a flavor of what we try to do or what we exploit, and then I'll stop. The idea is that I talked about muscles being noisy. There is noise all around us, which means that we are almost always being perturbed. It's just that it's not intentional perturbation from an experimenter, but natural perturbation from either from within the body or without the body, which means that if you draw sort of a face portrait, a slice of a face portrait for two variables, like I have there, it's not a perfect periodic curve, but you get a periodic band. It sort of circles around but never quite closes. What that means is exploring a region around this periodic orbit that we call walking, which means that the control system is always on, trying to pull it back to the periodic orbit, or at least keeping it from going way far away. So what we do is assume that steady human locomotion in the absence of explicit external perturbations is a periodic orbit of a smooth dynamical system plus some noise, which we don't know perhaps anything about, and then try to see if we can infer the dynamics in the neighborhood of this periodic orbit. The next few slides are about that. For instance, example 1 actually shows that we can infer things like if you push a person sideways, you will take a step sideways. We can do that by essentially exploring the variability from step to step. In other words, if you have a person walk hundreds of steps, their body is going to be a little too much to the right or a little too much to the left in maybe many tens of steps. And then as a consequence, people will be making little corrective measures on the next step. And essentially by computing, doing statistical inference of the map between upper body state and where you put your foot, we can essentially figure out what people are doing, at least very unconsciously in the absence of no external perturbations. You can actually also use use similar methods to infer a slightly more continuous description of the local dynamics, which I call factorized Poincare map. If you have this red periodic motion and people are sort of bouncing around this periodic motion or bouncing about this periodic motion all the time, and these are the sections which we call Poincare maps, and using essentially data from hundreds of thousands of steps, we can find maybe not hundreds of thousands of steps, but hundreds or thousands of steps. We can infer mapping from one slice to the next, which essentially lets you predict what people would do when external perturbations are applied, but you obtain the information by just looking at steady state data. In other words, we can predict, it's unclear whether or not these predictions are true because we haven't confirmed with perturbation experiments, but at least we can make predictions of what will happen in the presence of a perturbation from looking at steady state data, which sounds somewhat oxymoronic, but that's what it is. What do we want to do next? We want to infer controllers. Maybe I'll stop there and leave that slide on.
So I have a question regarding to the performance of exoskeleton for soldiers. So means in some studies people have used the spring element at the hip joint because power versus percentage of gait cycle progression is in particular zone is approximately sinusoidal.
Okay.
So in that case, what happened? They means absorb energy in the spring, and when it is in different phase, it releases. So ultimately, to take the advantage of the energy means through the spring, and that will reduce the amount of power consumption at the motor.
Right.
So for example, if I'm not using that spring, so how for example, I'm considering 65 kg person as a soldier. So how much means its percentage will vary from power consumption point of view if I'm not using a spring element?
You're not using a spring element, but what are you replacing it with?
Means, for example, I'm having an actuator over the hip joint.
I see.
And in a linear actuator, for example.
I see.
And in parallel to this, I'm using a spring element.
Okay.
For example, if this spring element is being removed, so how much the performance will vary from if I'm using the spring element and if I'm not using that?
Okay, I do not know the answer to that question, but we can find out the answer to that question by using the model that I just showed, or at least guess at the answer. We can model an exoskeleton as an actuator for which the energy cost is free and put a spring in series. So we can answer the question, or at least attempt to answer the question that you just asked using the model that I just described. But I don't know the answer off the top of my head. But let me say something else, which is somewhat surprising. Maybe you know this already. But so people have been trying to build exoskeletons to make it easy for people to lift weights is one. Another problem is to make it easy for people to walk, period. In other words, is there some device that you can wear on the body that will let you walk with lower energy cost than if you were not wearing it? right? So I'm walking with a particular energy. I wear something, some kind of a suit. Can I make my walking less energy efficient? That seems to be a remarkably hard problem. Like you would think, if I have actuators, I can add power. The necessity to produce power is what makes me consume energy. So if you add enough power, you would think our energy consumption will go down. But almost always, any exoskeleton that you wear, energy consumption goes up by 10%, 20% for normal walking. After many, many years of work, like there was a group that published a study maybe like 5 months ago that said that they designed an exoskeleton that reduced the energy cost of normal walking by about 3 or 4%. And then when other people repeated their experiments, not clear how strong that effect is. Seems very weak. So it seems incredibly hard to do little modifications to the body to reduce energy costs. So body seems very optimized somehow. Anyway, so that's a slightly different answer to your